The dust from the stagecoach settled around Lydia Porter's boots as she stepped down onto the sun-baked street of Ukiah, California, her carpetbag clutched tight in one hand and her late mother's Bible in the other. She had traveled 3 weeks from Boston to reach this remote outpost in Mendocino County, answering an advertisement for a schoolteacher that promised room, board, and $40 a month, which seemed like a fortune compared to the pittance she had been earning as a seamstress back east. The year was 1878, and at 23 years old, Lydia had nothing left for her in Massachusetts except painful memories and an empty apartment that smelled of camphor and loneliness. The California sun beat down with an intensity she had never experienced, making her wool traveling dress feel like a furnace against her skin. But she lifted her chin with determination as she surveyed the rough frontier town that would become her new home. The main street of Ukiah stretched before her in a haze of heat and possibility, lined with false-fronted buildings that promised civilization in a land still teetering between wilderness and settlement. A saloon stood on one corner, its painted sign faded by the relentless sun. Across the way, a general store displayed its wares behind dusty windows. Men on horseback rode past, their faces weathered and hard, their eyes assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that made her pull her shawl tighter despite the heat. She had expected the West to be different from Boston, but the reality of it struck her with sudden force as she stood alone on that street, thousands of miles from everything she had ever known. A tall man separated himself from the shadows of the general store's porch and walked toward her with the easy, rolling gait of someone who spent more time in the saddle than on his feet. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight. His face was sun-bronzed and angular, with a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily, though at the moment it was set in a serious line as he approached. He wore dusty denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest that had seen better days, with a gun belt slung low on his hips in a way that suggested he knew how to use it. "Miss Porter?" he asked, removing his hat to reveal that dark hair plastered slightly to his forehead with sweat. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel rolling in a stream, but there was something gentle in the way he spoke her name. "Yes," she replied, relieved that someone had come to meet her. "Are you from the school board?" He shook his head, a hint of amusement touching his eyes. "No, madam." "Name is Quinn Gallagher. I work the ranch just outside town, but Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house asked if I would fetch you from the stage since she was dealing with some trouble at her establishment. I have a wagon just over there." He gestured toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 patient-looking horses. "I will take you to your lodgings if that suits you." Lydia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She had little choice, and something about Quinn Gallagher's straightforward manner put her at ease despite the strangeness of the situation. She had expected a matron from the school board, not a cowboy with a gun on his hip and dust on his boots, but this was the West, and she would have to adjust her expectations accordingly. Quinn took her carpetbag without asking and walked toward the wagon, leaving her to follow with her Bible. He placed the bag in the back with care, then offered his hand to help her up onto the seat. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but respectful as he steadied her. She settled onto the wooden bench, arranging her skirts as best she could, and then he was beside her, taking up the reins with practiced ease. "How long have you been in Ukiah, Mr. Gallagher?" she asked as the wagon lurched into motion, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity, though she found herself wanting to know more about this man who had materialized to help her. "Call me Quinn, please," he said, guiding the horses down the rutted street. Been here about 5 years now. Came out from Texas after the war ended and my folks passed. Figured California was as good a place as any to start fresh. He glanced at her sidelong, and she saw kindness in those amber eyes. What brings a proper Boston lady all the way out here to teach children who are more likely to know how to rope a steer than read Shakespeare? She smiled despite herself. I needed a fresh start too. And I happen to think those children deserve to know Shakespeare just as much as they deserve to know how to rope steers. Cannot argue with that, Quinn said, and this time he did smile, transforming his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. Though I will tell you right now, you will have your work cut out for you. Most of the parents around here do not see much use in book learning when there is work to be done. They talked easily as the wagon rolled through town and out toward the boarding house, which sat on a slight rise overlooking the valley. Quinn told her about the ranch where he worked, about the hard winters and dry summers, about the challenges of raising cattle in country that could be unforgiving one moment and breathtakingly beautiful the next. Lydia found herself relaxing in his presence, drawn to his quiet confidence and the way he spoke about the land with genuine affection. She told him about Boston, about the narrow streets and crowded buildings, about teaching Sunday school to children in the tenements and dreaming of wider horizons. By the time they reached the boarding house, a tidy structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that defied the dry climate, Lydia felt as though she had made her first friend in California. Quinn helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her waist, and carried her bag to the porch where Mrs. Henderson waited, a robust woman with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense expression that softened when she saw Lydia. "There you are, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, bustling forward. "I am so sorry I could not meet you myself, but we had a situation with a rattlesnake in the chicken coop that required immediate attention. Thank you, Quinn, for fetching her." "My pleasure, madam," Quinn said, setting down the carpet-bag. He looked at Lydia, and something passed between them in that moment, some spark of connection that made her breath catch slightly. "Welcome to Ukiah, Miss Porter. I hope you will be happy here." "Thank you, Quinn," she said softly. "I hope so too." She watched him climb back onto the wagon and drive away, dust rising behind the wheels, and felt a strange tug in her chest that she could not quite name. Then Mrs. Henderson was ushering her inside, talking a mile a minute about meal times and house rules and the school where she would begin teaching in just 3 days, and Lydia pushed thoughts of amber eyes and calloused hands to the back of her mind. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Lydia met with the school board, 3 stern-faced men who questioned her credentials and warned her that frontier children were not like city children. They would test her patience and her resolve. She toured the one-room schoolhouse, noting the worn desks and limited supplies, and began planning lessons that would engage minds used to open spaces and practical concerns. Mrs. Henderson introduced her to other residents of Ukiah, a mix of merchants, ranchers, miners, and their families, all watching her with the careful assessment that newcomers received in small towns. She saw Quinn once more during those 2 days, when she was walking back from the general store with supplies for her room. He was riding past on a handsome sorrel gelding, and he tipped his hat to her, his face breaking into that transforming smile when she waved. Her heart did an unexpected flutter, and she found herself thinking about him more than was probably proper for a woman who had been in town less than a week. On her 3rd evening in Ukiah, Lydia woke in the night with a strange ache in her bones and a dryness in her throat that water could not quench. She attributed it to nerves about starting her teaching position the next day and tried to go back to sleep, but by morning she felt worse. Her head pounded, her throat burned, and when she looked in the small mirror above her washstand, her face was flushed with an unhealthy color that alarmed her. Still, she had responsibilities, and she was not about to let a simple cold keep her from her first day at the school. Mrs. Henderson took one look at her at breakfast and frowned. "You look peaked, dear. Are you feeling all right?" "Just a bit under the weather," Lydia insisted, forcing herself to eat a few bites of porridge even though her throat protested. "I will be fine once I get to the school." But she was not fine. By mid-morning, standing in front of 15 children ranging from ages 6 to 14, Lydia felt as though she was moving through thick syrup. Her voice came out raspy and weak as she tried to lead them through their lessons. The room swam around her, and the children's faces blurred together into a mass of concerned expressions. She gripped the edge of her desk, fighting to stay upright, determined not to fail on her very first day. Then the floor tilted, and everything went black. She woke in her room at the boarding house with no memory of how she had gotten there. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her bed, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, and even that gentle touch felt like fire against her skin. "Easy now," Mrs. Henderson murmured. "You gave us quite a scare, collapsing like that. Doc Merritt is on his way." The doctor, when he arrived, was an older man with silver mutton-cup sideburns and gentle hands that probed and examined while Lydia tried not to cry out from the pain that seemed to radiate through every part of her body. He asked questions that she answered as best she could through the fog in her mind, and she saw his expression grow grave. "It is scarlet fever," he said finally, directing his words to Mrs. Henderson rather than to Lydia, as though she was already too far gone to understand. "The rash will appear soon if I am right. She needs constant care day and night. The fever will get worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. Someone needs to stay with her, make sure she keeps breathing through the worst of it, get fluids in her when she can take them." Mrs. Henderson wrung her hands. "Doctor, I have 7 other boarders and a house to run. I cannot sit with her day and night, though I wish I could." "Then we need to find someone who can," Doc Merritt said grimly, "because if she is left alone and the fever spikes too high, she will not survive it." Through the haze of her illness, Lydia heard these words and felt fear lance through her sharper than any physical pain. She had come all this way for a new life, and now she was going to die in a strange town among strangers, alone and far from anyone who had ever loved her. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, and she turned her face toward the wall, too weak even to properly weep. Voices continued in the room, discussion and planning that she could not quite follow. Then Mrs. Henderson was gone, and the doctor was spooning something bitter into her mouth, and darkness claimed her again. When next she surfaced toward consciousness, she was aware of 3 things: the terrible heat that consumed her from within, the painful rasping of her own breath, and a presence beside her bed that had not been there before. She forced her eyes open, though even that small act required monumental effort, and saw Quinn Gallagher sitting in the chair that Mrs. Henderson had occupied earlier. He had pulled it close to the bed, and he was watching her with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable if she had the energy to care about such things. "Quinn," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to her own ears. "I am here," he said, leaning forward. "Mrs. Henderson came to the ranch, told me you were sick and needed someone to sit with you. I volunteered." "You should not," she managed to say, each word an effort. "Might catch it." "Already had scarlet fever when I was a boy," he said matter-of-factly. "Cannot get it twice. So I am the perfect person for this job." He reached for a cup of water on the bedside table, carefully lifting her head enough to help her take a few sips. The water was cool and soothing, though it hurt to swallow. You just focus on breathing and fighting this thing, Miss Porter. I will make sure you keep doing both." She wanted to thank him, wanted to ask why he would do this for someone he barely knew, wanted to protest that he surely had more important things to do than sit in a sick room with a dying schoolteacher. But the darkness was pulling at her again, and she surrendered to it, somehow comforted by the knowledge that Quinn Gallagher was standing watch. The days that followed existed in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror that reflected only distorted images. Lydia burned. The fever consumed her, turning her skin to fire and her thoughts to ash. The rash appeared just as the doctor had predicted, spreading across her chest and neck in rough patches that itched and burned. Her throat swelled until each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to know where she was, more often lost in fevered dreams that made no sense. Through it all, Quinn stayed. She would surface from the darkness to find him there, always there, his presence as constant as the fever itself. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, trying to bring down the terrible heat. He supported her head while Doc Merritt or Mrs. Henderson spooned broth or medicine into her mouth. He spoke to her in that low, gravelly voice, telling her stories about Texas and California, about horses he had known and places he had been, giving her something to anchor to in the storm of her illness. On the second night, or maybe it was the third, she could not be sure, the fever spiked so high that she stopped recognizing where she was entirely. She thrashed in the bed, crying out for her mother who had been dead for 2 years, begging for water that burned like acid when it touched her ravaged throat. Strong hands held her down, kept her from hurting herself in her delirium, and through the chaos she heard Quinn's voice, steady and sure. "You are all right, Lydia. You are safe. I have got you. Just keep breathing. That is all you have to do, just keep breathing." She clung to that voice like a lifeline. When the darkness tried to pull her under completely, she heard Quinn calling her back. When the pain made her want to surrender and let go, his presence beside her bed reminded her that someone cared whether she lived or died. He became her anchor, the only real thing in a world that had dissolved into fever and pain. Doc Merritt came twice a day, his expression growing more worried each time. She heard him talking to Quinn in low tones, heard words like crisis and next 24 hours and prepare yourself. But Quinn's response was always the same, spoken with quiet determination. "She is going to make it. She is stronger than she looks." Mrs. Henderson brought food and fresh water, helped change Lydia's sweat-soaked nightgown, expressed amazement that Quinn continued to sit vigil without rest. "You need to sleep," she told him more than once. "You cannot stay awake forever." "I can stay awake long enough," Quinn replied. "Sleep when this is over." Lydia wanted to tell him to rest, to stop sacrificing himself for her sake, but she could not form the words. All her energy went into the simple act of breathing, of pulling air into her swollen throat and burning lungs, of keeping her heart beating through each endless hour. She would not give up, not when Quinn refused to give up on her. On the fourth day, or perhaps the fifth, time had lost all meaning. Something shifted. The fever still raged, but Lydia found herself clinging to consciousness for longer periods. She could focus her eyes well enough to see Quinn slumped in the chair beside her, his face drawn and haggard, dark circles under his eyes that spoke of days without sleep. His hand rested on the edge of her bed, close enough that she could see the calluses on his palm, the scrapes and scars that came from hard work and harder living. She wanted to reach for that hand, to make some gesture of gratitude, but her arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. As if sensing her attention, Quinn stirred and straightened, his eyes flying open to check on her. When he saw she was awake and lucid, Relief flooded his face so openly that it made her chest ache with something other than illness. "Welcome back," he said, his voice hoarse from his own exhaustion. "You gave me a scare there for a while." "How long?" she whispered. 5 days, he said, reaching for the water glass. 5 days of fighting, but the fever broke about an hour ago. Doc Merritt says you are past the worst of it now. He helped her drink, his hand supporting her head with infinite gentleness. "You just need to rest and regain your strength." "You stayed," she said, the wonder of it hitting her even through her weakened state. "The whole time." "Told you I would make sure you kept breathing," Quinn said simply, as if sitting awake for 5 days straight to watch over a near stranger was the most natural thing in the world. "Could not very well go back on my word." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she was too tired to stop them. "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those amber eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, something in me recognized something in you. I know that does not make much sense. We barely know each other. But I could not let you die, Lydia. I just could not." The sound of her first name on his lips, spoken with such raw honesty, broke something open inside her. Or perhaps it opened something that had been closed for too long. She lifted her hand from the bed, the motion taking all her strength, and he immediately grasped it in his own, holding on as though she was precious. "Thank you," she whispered, "for my life." "You did the hard part," Quinn said, but his thumb was stroking the back of her hand in a gesture that felt like more than simple comfort. "You fought like hell. I just made sure you did not fight alone." She fell asleep holding his hand, and for the first time in days, the sleep was natural and restorative rather than the dark pull of fever. When she woke again, afternoon light was slanting through the window, and Quinn was still there, though he had finally succumbed to exhaustion himself. His head pillowed on his arms on the edge of her bed, his hand still clasping hers. Recovery was slow and frustrating. The scarlet fever had left her weak as a newborn kitten, barely able to sit up without assistance for the first few days. Her throat remained painful for more than a week, and the rash took time to fade. But each day brought small improvements, and through it all, Quinn visited regularly, bringing books from his small collection at the ranch, reading to her when she was too tired to read herself, playing simple card games when she grew strong enough to hold the cards. Mrs. Henderson watched these visits with knowing eyes and a small smile, saying nothing but clearly approving. Doc Merritt, checking on Lydia's progress, remarked that Quinn had performed a minor miracle by keeping her alive through the worst of the fever. "Most people would not have had the stamina to stay awake that long," the doctor said. "You owe him your life, young lady." Lydia knew this already, felt the weight and gift of it every time Quinn walked into her room. But it was more than gratitude that made her heart lift when she heard his footsteps on the stairs, more than simple appreciation that made her watch the door in the hours between his visits. She was falling in love with Quinn Gallagher, and the realization both terrified and exhilarated her. She tried to tell herself it was just the natural attachment of a patient to someone who had saved them, that her feelings would fade once she was fully recovered and return to her normal life. But she knew, deep in her bones, that what she felt for Quinn was real and rare and worth whatever risk loving him might entail. 3 weeks after she had first fallen ill, Lydia was finally well enough to leave her room and venture downstairs for meals. She still tired easily, and her voice retained a raspy quality that Doc Merritt said might be permanent. But she was alive and recovering, which was more than anyone had expected during those dark days of fever. The school board had found a temporary replacement teacher, but they assured her the position would be hers again once she was fully well. Quinn came to visit on a Sunday afternoon, his hat in his hands and an unusual nervousness in his manner that made Lydia sit up straighter in the parlor chair where she had been reading. Mrs. Henderson had conveniently found business elsewhere in the house, leaving them alone in the sun-filled room. "I need to say something," Quinn began, then stopped, turning his hat in his hands. "And I am not much good with fancy words, so I am just going to speak plain." "I prefer plain speaking," Lydia said softly, her heart beginning to race. He met her eyes directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "These past weeks, sitting with you, talking with you, getting to know you, have been the best of my life despite the circumstances. I know we have not known each other long, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I have fallen in love with you, Lydia Porter, completely and irrevocably in love with you." Joy bloomed in her chest so suddenly and powerfully that she felt lightheaded. "Quinn, Let me finish," he said, moving closer and kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "I am just a cowboy. I do not have much to offer except a small house on the ranch and whatever wages I can earn. But I am a hard worker and I am honest, and I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on me. I want to court you properly if you will let me. I want to see where this goes between us." "Where it goes," Lydia said, her voice breaking slightly. "Quinn, I already know where it goes. I fell in love with you while you were reading to me from that ridiculous dime novel about the outlaw with the heart of gold. Probably before that, if I am being honest. You saved my life, but more than that, you made me want to live it." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a long night. "So that is a yes to courting." "That is a yes to whatever you want," she said. And then his hands were cradling her face with infinite gentleness, mindful of her still fragile state, and he was kissing her softly, sweetly, with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," she whispered back, and it felt like a vow, like a promise made before heaven and earth. They took their time with the courtship despite knowing their hearts were already committed. Quinn wanted to do things properly, to give Lydia the romance and respect she deserved. He called on her at the boarding house 3 times a week, bringing wildflowers picked from the hills around his ranch, taking her for walks when she grew strong enough, telling her stories about his life, and listening with genuine interest to hers. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared tastes in books and music, laughing over differences in opinion about matters both serious and silly. He introduced her to his life at the ranch, a sprawling operation owned by a gruff but fair man named Samuel Tucker, who treated his hands well and paid decent wages. Quinn showed Lydia the small house he rented on the property, a 2-room cabin that was rough but sturdy, with a view of the mountains that took her breath away. He spoke of his dreams for the future, of maybe owning his own land someday, of raising horses as well as cattle. Lydia, for her part, returned to teaching once she was fully recovered, finding that the children who had witnessed her collapse on that first day, now, regarded her with a mixture of awe and affection. Her near-death experience had become legend in the small town, and Quinn's vigil beside her bed had elevated him to hero status among people who already respected him. Everyone in Ukiah seemed to know about the cowboy who had stayed awake for days to save the schoolteacher's life, and they watched the developing romance with approval and interest. By the time autumn arrived, painting the hills around Ukiah in shades of gold and amber, Quinn and Lydia had become an established couple in the eyes of the town. They attended church services together, went to community dances, joined picnics and social gatherings as a pair. Mrs. Henderson treated Quinn like a son, always making sure there was extra pie when he came to call. On a clear October evening, Quinn took Lydia riding out to a high meadow on the ranch where the sunset painted the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink and purple. They sat on a blanket he had brought, looking out over the valley while their horses grazed nearby. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Lydia felt warm wrapped in the shawl Quinn had draped over her shoulders. "I spoke to Reverend Matthews yesterday," Quinn said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Asked him what he thought about a wedding in December, if I could convince a certain stubborn schoolteacher to marry me." Lydia turned to look at him, her heart in her throat. "And what did Reverend Matthews say?" "He said he thought it was a fine idea, provided the schoolteacher in question agreed." Quinn shifted to face her more fully, taking both her hands in his. "Lydia, I know we have not been courting for that long by some standards, but I have known since that first day I met you at the stagecoach that you were special. And sitting beside your bed while you fought for your life just made me more certain that I want to spend every moment I can with you. I do not want to wait years to start our life together. Marry me, Lydia. Be my wife, let me be your husband, and we will figure out everything else as we go." "Yes," she said without hesitation, joy spilling through her like champagne bubbles. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you. I would marry you tomorrow if we could arrange it." He laughed, a sound of pure happiness, and pulled her close, kissing her with more passion than he had allowed himself during their careful courtship. She melted into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished and more alive than she had ever felt in her carefully circumscribed Boston life. This was what she had crossed the country to find, though she had not known it at the time. This man, this love, this sense of coming home to a place she had never been. They married on a cold December morning in the small church that served Ukiah's faithful, with half the town crammed into the pews to witness the union of the schoolteacher and the cowboy who loved her. Lydia wore a simple dress of blue silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Quinn wore his best suit, brushed and pressed until it looked nearly new, his dark hair tamed for once, his face solemn as he watched her walk down the aisle toward him. Doc Merritt gave her away, the old physician's eyes suspiciously bright as he placed her hand in Quinn's. "Take care of her," he told Quinn gruffly. "She is tougher than she looks, but she is still precious." "I know," Quinn said simply. "I will guard her with my life." The vows they spoke were traditional, the words worn smooth by countless couples before them, but Lydia felt the weight and truth of every promise. To love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them. They had already been tested by sickness, had already proven what they would sacrifice for each other. These vows were not just hopeful words, but a recognition of what already existed between them. When Quinn kissed her as the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause and cheers. Lydia felt tears of happiness streaming down her face as Quinn held her close, his own eyes suspiciously bright. The reception was held at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson having insisted on hosting and preparing a feast that seemed impossible given the modest resources of a frontier town. There was roast beef and potatoes, fresh bread and butter, apple pie and cake, and someone had brought out a fiddle so there could be dancing. Quinn led Lydia through a waltz on the boarding house's parlor floor, holding her as though she was made of spun glass, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy, Mrs. Gallagher?" he asked, his voice low and intimate despite the crowd around them. "Happier than I have ever been," she said honestly. "You have given me a life I did not know was possible, Quinn." "We have given each other that," he corrected gently. "This is just the beginning, Lydia. We have years ahead of us, a whole life to build together." They moved into Quinn's cabin on the ranch, and Lydia discovered that she loved the simplicity of their life there. She continued teaching through the winter, riding into town each morning on the gentle mare Quinn had bought for her, and returning each evening to the cabin that became more of a home with each passing day. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted herbs in a small garden patch Quinn cleared for her, learned to cook the simple but hearty meals that sustained ranch life. Quinn threw himself into his work with renewed energy, saving every penny toward his dream of owning land. He was patient and kind, passionate and gentle, everything Lydia could have wanted in a husband. They talked late into the night, made love with a tenderness that sometimes brought tears to her eyes, laughed over small domestic mishaps, and celebrated small victories together. Spring came to the valley in a rush of wildflowers and new grass, and with it came news that Samuel Tucker was selling off parcels of the ranch to his most trusted hands at fair prices. Quinn immediately approached his boss about purchasing land, and after negotiation and careful calculation of their savings, they secured 200 acres of good grazing land with water rights to a spring-fed creek. It was more than they had dared hope for, and Lydia saw Quinn's pride and joy in owning his own land reflected in every line of his face. "We will build a proper house," he told her, walking the property with her hand clasped in his. "Nothing fancy, but solid and comfortable. Room for children when they come. A barn for horses, because I want to start breeding quality stock. This is ours, Lydia, our land, our future." By summer, with help from neighbors and fellow ranch hands, the frame of their new house was rising on a gentle slope that overlooked the creek. It would be modest by Eastern standards, but to Lydia it was a palace. She watched it take shape with wonder, seeing their future being built board by board. Quinn worked from dawn to dusk, splitting his time between the construction and his continued obligations to Tucker's remaining herd, but he always came home to her, always had energy to hold her close and ask about her day. That summer, Lydia discovered she was carrying their first child. She told Quinn one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sun set over their new land. He had been tired from a long day of work, but the news transformed him, his face lighting up with such joy that she laughed through her own happy tears. "A baby," he breathed, his hand moving reverently to her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, though she could see the answer written plainly on his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Quinn said, pulling her into his lap and holding her close. "You have given me so much, Lydia. Love, a home, a reason to build something lasting, and now a child. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." They moved into the new house in September, just as Lydia's pregnancy was beginning to show. The house smelled of fresh wood and paint, of new beginnings and fulfilled promises. It had 3 rooms downstairs, a large main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom for them, and a smaller room that would be the nursery. Upstairs was an open loft that could be divided into additional bedrooms as their family grew. It was simple but well built, with a stone fireplace that Quinn had laid himself and windows that let in the morning light. Lydia had to give up teaching as her pregnancy progressed, but she did not mind. She had loved the work, but she loved the life she was building with Quinn more. She spent her days making their house a home, sewing baby clothes and blankets, preparing for the arrival of their child. Neighbors stopped by regularly, the women offering advice and assistance, the men helping Quinn with the ongoing work of establishing their ranch. Their son was born on a cold February morning in 1880, delivered by Doc Merritt with Mrs. Henderson assisting and Quinn pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. The labor was long and difficult, And there were moments when the doctor's face grew grave, when Lydia heard Quinn demanding to know if she was all right. But she remembered those dark days of scarlet fever, remembered fighting for every breath, and she drew on that same determination to bring their child into the world. When Doc Merritt finally opened the door and told Quinn he could come in, Lydia was exhausted but triumphant, cradling their red-faced, squalling son against her chest. Quinn approached slowly, as if afraid to disturb some fragile magic, and when he looked down at their child, tears flowed unashamedly down his weathered face. "He is perfect," Quinn whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist with one calloused finger. "You are perfect. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you for him, for this, for everything." They named him Thomas Samuel Gallagher, after Quinn's father and the rancher who had given them their start. Thomas was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up at night and filled their days with wonder. Quinn proved to be a devoted father, taking his son out to see the horses as soon as Lydia allowed it, talking to the baby about the land and cattle and dreams for the future, as though Thomas could understand every word. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and deep satisfaction. Their ranch grew steadily, not into an empire but into a solid, sustainable operation that provided well for their needs. Quinn developed a reputation for breeding quality horses, and buyers came from as far away as San Francisco to purchase his stock. Lydia managed the household and helped with the ranch accounts, her Boston education proving useful in ways she had never expected. More children came. A daughter named Rose in 1882, another son named James in 1884, and finally another daughter named Caroline in 1887. The house that had seemed spacious when they built it grew crowded and loud with the sound of children playing and arguing and laughing. Quinn expanded the loft, creating proper bedrooms for their growing family, and Lydia filled the rooms with love and the smell of baking bread, and the organized chaos that came with raising 4 active children on a working ranch. Through it all, through sleepless nights with sick children and lean years when drought threatened the cattle, through successes and setbacks, Quinn and Lydia's love for each other only deepened. They never forgot those first days when he had sat vigil beside her sick, keeping her tethered to life through sheer force of will and devotion. It had been the foundation on which everything else was built, the proof that what they felt for each other was worth any sacrifice, any hardship. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Lydia back to the meadow where he had proposed, leaving the children with Mrs. Henderson, who was now gray-haired but still spry enough to manage 4 energetic youngsters for an evening. They sat on a blanket as they had a decade before, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed impossibly vivid. "You ever regret it?" Quinn asked, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him. "Leaving Boston, coming out here, marrying a cowboy with more dreams than dollars." Lydia turned to look at him, seeing the lines that time and hard work had etched around his eyes, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the face that had become more dear to her than her own. "Not for a single second. You gave me my life twice, Quinn. Once when you kept me breathing through the fever, and once when you showed me what it meant to truly live. I would choose you and this life over anything else the world could offer." He kissed her then, sweet and lingering, tasting of coffee and the peppermint stick he had been chewing. "I love you, Lydia Gallagher. More today than the day I married you, more than yesterday, and less than I will tomorrow. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "We are the best thing that happened to each other," she corrected, echoing words he had said years ago. "This is our story, Quinn, not mine or yours, but ours, and I would not change a word of it." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they held each other close, Two people who had found in each other everything they had been searching for without knowing they searched. The fever that had nearly killed Lydia had instead become the crucible in which their love was forged, tested, and proven true. Their children grew and thrived, each one carving their own path in the world, but always carrying with them the lessons of love and dedication their parents had modeled. Thomas took over the ranch eventually, continuing the legacy his father had built from nothing but determination and dreams. Rose married a doctor and moved to Sacramento, but visited often with her own children. James became a teacher like his mother had been, opening a school in a neighboring town. Caroline, the youngest, stayed close to home, marrying a local rancher and settling on land that adjoined her parents' property. Quinn and Lydia grew old together, their love weathering the passage of time like a tree putting down deeper roots with each passing year. They sat on the porch of their house in the evenings, watching the sunset over land they had built a life on, holding hands as they had since the beginning. Quinn's hair went fully silver, and arthritis settled into the hands that had held Lydia through sickness and health. Lydia's voice, raspy since the scarlet fever, grew softer with age, but she still sang to her grandchildren the way she had sung to her own babies. On a quiet spring evening in 1920, 42 years after Quinn had first watched Lydia step off the stagecoach in Ukiah, they sat together as the last light faded from the sky. Quinn had not been well lately, his heart growing weaker, and they both knew the time they had left together was growing short. But there was no fear in it, no regret for a life fully lived and deeply shared. "You know what I remember most clearly," Quinn said, his voice thin but steady. "That first moment I saw you on the street, looking so determined and scared and brave all at once. Something in me just knew you were going to change my life." "You changed mine," Lydia said, leaning her white head against his shoulder. "Saved it, really. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," Quinn insisted, kissing the top of her head. "And we built something beautiful together. A family, a legacy, a love that will outlast both of us." "Promise me something," Lydia whispered. "Anything. When you go, do not go far. Stay close enough that I can feel you near." "I cannot imagine existing in a world where you do not." "I will never be far from you," Quinn promised. "Not even death could separate us completely, not after everything we have been through together. But you have to promise me something too." "What?" "Live fully for however much time you have left. Enjoy our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Sit in the sun and remember all the good times. Do not spend your remaining days just waiting to join me. Live, Lydia, the way you fought to live when the fever had you. For me." "I promise," she whispered, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "But it will be hard without you." "I know," he said gently. "But you are the strongest person I have ever known. You survived scarlet fever when the odds were against you, built a life in a rough frontier town far from everything you knew, raised 4 children on a working ranch, and loved me through all my flaws and failures. You can do this too." Quinn passed peacefully in his sleep 2 nights later, his hand clasped in Lydia's, his last words a whispered "I love you" that she would carry in her heart for the rest of her days. The grief was profound, a physical pain that made her understand how people could die of broken hearts. But she remembered her promise to him, and she found the strength to go on. Lydia lived for 7 more years, surrounded by children and grandchildren who adored her, watching new generations take their place in the world. She told stories about Quinn to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive not just as the man who had loved her, but as the cowboy who had once stayed awake for days to keep a dying woman breathing, who had built a life from nothing through hard work and determination, who had proven that love could indeed conquer anything when given the chance. On a warm June evening in 1927, Lydia passed away in her sleep in the house Quinn had built for her, surrounded by photographs of their life together. Her last thoughts were of that moment when she had first woken from the fever to find Quinn watching over her. The moment she had first understood that she was loved with a depth and purity she had never imagined possible. She died with a smile on her face, knowing that the life she had lived had been exactly the one she was meant for. They buried her beside Quinn in the small cemetery overlooking the valley, under a stone that bore both their names and a simple inscription. They saved each other. And in that peaceful place, surrounded by the land they had loved and the legacy they had built, their story found its ending, which was really just another kind of beginning. The love they had shared rippled outward through their descendants, a testament to what could happen when two people chose to fight for each other, to build something lasting, to trust in love even when everything else seemed uncertain. The ranch continued on through the generations, and with it, the story of how it all began, with a cowboy and a schoolteacher, a deadly fever and a vigil that proved love was not just about the grand gestures but about showing up, staying present, and refusing to let go of something precious even when the darkness pressed close. It was a love story like no other and exactly like every great love story, unique in its details but universal in its truth that real love, the kind that lasts, is built not just on passion but on choosing each other every single day, through sickness and health, through hardship and triumph, until death and even beyond. Their story became legend in Ukiah, told and retold as an example of what was possible when two souls found their perfect match. And somewhere in the eternal realm beyond mortal understanding, Quinn and Lydia were together again, forever young, forever in love, forever grateful for that day when chance and destiny conspired to bring a cowboy and a schoolteacher together in a rough frontier town, setting in motion a love that would echo through generations, and prove that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness and the courage to stay when everything else says to leave.